Hey sleepyheads, hope your day was great. Before we start, let's play a game. Comment the time where you are right now and whether you should be asleep already. Let's see who's the biggest night owl. Before you settle in, tap that like button and subscribe to keep the cozy vibes coming. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's drift into sleep. For context, I'm a middle-aged man living on the outskirts of Whitford, a quiet market town in northern England. My house sits at the end of a long country lane, the last in a row of older stone-built homes. There's a railway track that runs behind my back garden, though it's mostly freight trains and the occasional late-night passenger service. From my bedroom window, I can see Whitford Station, its dim orange glow barely illuminating the empty platform at night. It's convenient, really work in the city, so I never miss the morning train. I know the schedule by heart. That's why I was so confused when I first noticed the 2:42 train on Wednesday, 3rd May. It woke me up. I sleep lightly, always have, and the distant rumble of wheels on steel pulled me from a restless dream. Groggy, I sat up in bed, turned toward the window, and peered through the blinds. A single carriage train had stopped at the station. No logo, no branding, just a dull gray exterior, its windows completely black. No passengers, no driver, no station announcements. I frowned. There was number 242 service. The last scheduled train passed at 11:58 p.m., and the next one wasn't due until 5:15 a.m. I watched for a moment longer, expecting it to pull away. It didn't. It just sat there humming faintly under the flickering platform lights. Then, after exactly 30 seconds, it moved. No engine roar, no clatter of tracks, just a smooth, silent glide until it disappeared into the night. I checked the schedule online, nothing. I assumed it was some unscheduled maintenance service. Still, I made a mental note of it and went back to sleep. But the next night, it happened again. And the night after that, I watched the 2:42 train every night for a week, always stopping for precisely 30 seconds, always empty. It never made a sound except for the faint hum of its idling engine. I asked around. Nobody else had noticed it, not my co-workers, not the handful of neighbors I had. Even the guy at the ticket office looked at me like I was mad when I asked about a 2:42 train. So, I started keeping notes. 2:42 a.m., train arrives. 2 hours 42 minutes and 30 seconds a.m., train departs. No passengers, no driver, no sound. I even took pictures, but every time I looked at them in the morning, they were completely black. I posted about it online, trying to find some explanation. Most people ignored me, but one comment stood out. "Don't board it." That was it, no context, just that warning. I shrugged it off. I wasn't planning on stepping onto a mystery ghost train in the middle of the night. But then came Tuesday, 16th May. That night, the train arrived as usual, but as I lay in bed, watching from the safety of my window, I heard something that made my stomach drop. A scream. Not a distant, muffled sound, not something carried on the wind. It was clear, raw, panicked. Somebody was inside the train. I bolted upright, my heart hammering. The scream cut off abruptly, leaving only the soft hum of the idling engine. I stared at the train, my gut twisted. For the first time in weeks, I felt genuinely afraid. I reached for my phone, no signal. I checked the Wi-Fi, disconnected. I flicked the bedside lamp, Nothing. My entire house had lost power. That was when I noticed something else. Outside, beyond the station, the entire town was dark. No streetlights, no houses glowing in the distance. Just blackness. It was as if the world had stopped. I hesitated. Every part of my brain screamed at me to stay inside, to ignore whatever was happening out there. But that scream, I couldn't pretend I hadn't heard it. I grabbed a flashlight, threw on a coat, and stepped out into the night. The air was thick and still, too quiet. I walked down the garden path, my breath loud in the silence. The distant hum of the train felt wrong, like it was vibrating through my chest. I reached the station. The train doors were open. The interior was pitch black. I stood there, flashlight trembling in my grip. I thought of that comment, "Don't board it." But someone had screamed. Someone was in there. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The second my foot touched the metal floor, the doors slammed shut. I spun around, yanking at the handle, locked. The lights flickered to life. And then I saw her. A girl no older than 8, sitting alone at the far end of the carriage. She had long black hair, and she was wearing a white dress stained with dirt. Her face was buried in her hands, her shoulders trembling. I took a cautious step forward. "Hey, are you all right?" I asked. No response. I swallowed hard. My pulse thumped in my throat. I took another step, closing the distance between us. "Are you hurt? Do you need help?" She stopped shaking. Then, in a whisper so soft I barely heard it, "You shouldn't have gotten on." My flashlight flickered and died. Darkness swallowed us whole. Then, from the far end of the carriage, a sound. Low, wheezing breaths. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Coming closer. I turned my head toward the aisle, heart hammering. The dim emergency lights cast faint shadows, just enough to see something moving. A figure. Tall, wrong. It moved in unnatural jerks, its elongated limbs dragging against the seats. The girl lifted her head. I saw her face. Her eyes were black holes. Her lips curled into a sad, knowing smile. "You can't leave now," she whispered. The figure lunged. I threw myself backward, scrambling toward the door, my hands hammered against the glass, my breath ragged. "Let me out! Let me out!" The train lurched forward. The last thing I saw before the world blurred. Was the girl watching me? And the shadow crawling closer. The train wasn't stopping. Outside, the world blurred not like normal motion, but as if reality itself was melting, warping, shifting in ways my mind couldn't comprehend. It wasn't just speed, it was wrong. I slammed my fists against the door, my breath sharp and ragged. "Stop the train, let me off." The girl stayed seated, her small hands neatly folded in her lap. Her dark eyes never blinked. "You can't leave yet," she said softly. The thing in the aisle, the shadow with limbs too long, too jagged, was crawling closer. Its hunched form scraped against the ceiling, its breath a horrible wet rasp. It didn't hurry. It didn't need to. I stumbled backward, my body pressed against the door. My hands shook as I searched for something, anything to defend myself. My flashlight was dead. My phone had no signal. The emergency hammer. There, bolted next to the window. I lunged for it, yanking the small red-handled hammer free. My fingers tightened around it, my breath coming in gasps. The creature stopped. It cocked its head at an unnatural angle, as if it had never seen someone fight back before. Then it laughed. A dry, rattling sound like bones scraping together. I didn't wait. I raised the hammer and swung. The window shattered. Cold air rushed in as glass sprayed into the carriage. The wind howled, pulling at my clothes, tugging me toward the open void. For a split second, I thought I could make it. Jump, tumble, roll, escape. Then the girl stood. Don't. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a threat. It was a plea. The way she said it, I hesitated, just for a second. And in that second, the thing grabbed me. Its fingers weren't fingers just cold, stretching tendrils that wrapped around my wrist, around my shoulder, my chest. It yanked me back into the train with impossible strength, slamming me onto the floor. Pain exploded through my ribs, my lungs emptied. I struggled, twisting, trying to break free, but the thing's grip only tightened. I turned my head, gasping, and saw the girl watching me. Not scared, not amused, just watching. Like she had seen this happen before. The train rattled, the walls trembling like they were barely holding together. The overhead lights flickered wildly, casting the creature's writhing form in half light, half shadow. I knew what would happen next. I wouldn't leave this train. I would vanish. I would become one of the missing people you hear about on the news. Just another unsolved case, a name that fades from memory. Unless I broke the cycle. With the last of my strength, I twisted my body, swinging the hammer again. This time, not at the window. At the girl. She flinched, just a flicker of surprise. And the creature screamed. A sound that shook the entire train, splitting metal, shattering lights. Everything exploded. The train, the windows, the seats, all of it, shattered into a storm of glass and shadows. I felt myself falling not forward, not backward, just falling. The girl's voice echoed. Run. Then, impact. A rush of air. I hit the ground, hard. My body skidded against rough gravel, pain jolting up my spine. The world wasn't moving anymore. I coughed, blinking against the sharp, early morning light. I was on the tracks. Cold steel rails stretched out before me. Behind me, nothing. No train, no wreckage. Just empty, silent railway tracks. I was alive. I groaned, rolling onto my back. My ribs screamed in protest. My palms were scraped raw. I forced myself to sit up, looking around. Whitford Station was ahead. The sun was rising. I turned toward the horizon, my breath catching. The station clock read 5:13 a.m. I had made it. I climbed to my feet, staggering toward the platform. My legs were shaking. My lungs burned. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The 2:42 train was gone, and I knew somehow that it would never come back. The first thing I did when I got home was lock every door and window. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. My entire body ached, and my mind wouldn't stop replaying the night over and over again. The shadow, the train, the girl. Who was she? Why did she warn me in the end? I don't know. I don't think I ever will. But I do know one thing. The train had been waiting for me. And if I had stayed on it, if I hadn't fought back, I would have been lost forever. It took me a while to get back to some kind of normal. I moved away, not far, just to the city, somewhere with people, noise, life. I never spoke about what happened. Who would believe me? But sometimes, late at night, when I close my eyes, I hear it. A distant hum. Not from a car, not from the city, from tracks that no longer exist. A train that no longer runs. A train that I refuse to remember. The night shift wasn't supposed to be this bad. I had done it before hell. I'd done it for years. There was something strangely peaceful about working nights. The world slowed down, the city grew quiet, and for a few hours, it felt like I had the whole place to myself. But tonight felt wrong. I worked security at an office building downtown. Nothing fancy, just a 4-story corporate block, all glass windows and beige cubicles. It was the kind of place where people sat under artificial lights for 8 hours a day, staring at screens, drowning in emails. At night, it was a different world. No ringing phones, no buzzing conversations, just silence and the faint hum of the vending machines in the break room. I started my shift at 11 p.m. like always, walked the halls, checked the doors, made sure everything was locked up. I knew this place better than my own apartment. Every flickering light, every creaky floorboard, every vent that let out an eerie whistle when the AC kicked in. And yet, tonight, something felt off. It started around 1:30 a.m. I was making my usual rounds, walking past a row of dark cubicles, when I heard it. A soft rustling noise, like fabric shifting, like someone moving just barely. I stopped, listened. The sound came from the far end of the office, near the manager's desk. I exhaled. Probably nothing. Maybe the AC had blown a stack of papers off a desk. Maybe I was just tired. I turned the corner and froze. The manager's desk sat in its usual place, a towering mahogany thing cluttered with folders, an old coffee mug, and a dead plant. But something wasn't right. There was a pair of feet sticking out from underneath it. Bare feet. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. For a second, my brain refused to process what I was looking at. Then, slowly, my eyes traced upward. A man was hunched beneath the desk, his body contorted, folded into a shape that didn't seem natural. His arms were wrapped around his knees, his face buried between them. And he wasn't moving. Just sitting there. Bent. Hiding. My heart pounded in my throat. "Sir?" My voice cracked. No response. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and pointed it straight at him. The second the beam hit his skin, he moved. His head snapped up so fast it was like he had been yanked by invisible strings. And for the first time, I saw his face. I wish I hadn't. His skin was gray, not pale, not sickly gray, like concrete, like something long dead. His eyes were wide, too wide, bulging out of their sockets, his pupils like tiny pinpricks. His mouth was slightly open, lips dry and cracked, as if he had been sitting there for hours. Or days. I took a step back. My throat was dry. "Sir," Are you all right? He didn't blink, didn't move, just stared. I reached for my radio. Dispatch, this is. The man scuttled out from under the desk. Not crawled, not stood. Scuttled. Like a spider. His limbs moved too fast, his joints bending in ways that didn't make sense. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a chair. The man's head twitched to the side, his neck bending at an impossible angle. Then, in a voice that wasn't his, he whispered, "You shouldn't be here." I ran. Didn't think, didn't look back, just ran. My feet pounded against the floor as I tore through the office, past rows of empty desks, past the flickering break room light, straight toward the exit. I grabbed the door handle locked. Number. No. I fumbled for my key card, hands shaking, breath coming in short, ragged gasps. A sound came from behind me. The scuttling. Closer now. Too close. I slammed the key card against the scanner, again and again and again. Beep. The lock clicked. I ripped the door open and threw myself outside into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. Didn't stop shaking until I had locked the doors, hands white-knuckled around the steering wheel. I sat there for a long time, heart hammering in my chest, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The office building stood silent, its dark windows empty. Like I had imagined the whole thing. Like he had never been there at all. The next day I quit. No 2 weeks' notice. No explanation. Just left. I didn't tell my boss what I saw. Didn't tell anyone. Because I knew. They wouldn't believe me. And even if they did, what could they do? A week later, I drove by the building one last time. Just to see. The lights were on. A new security guard stood at the front desk, reading a newspaper, looking bored. Like nothing had ever happened. I almost felt relieved. Until I looked closer. In the farthest window, near the manager's office, something moved. Something bent. Something hiding. And for a brief second, I saw a pair of wide, unblinking eyes staring back at me. Waiting. My name is Ethan. For most of my life, I believed my father was the most dangerous man I had ever known. Not because he was violent, though wasn't. Not because he was cruel, not in the way most people would define it. No, his danger was subtler. It was in the way he made me feel like I was always one step away from eternal suffering. My father was a preacher, a fire and brimstone type, the kind who didn't just warn about hell but spoke about it like he had been there himself. He would tell me stories at night, stories that had no happy endings. "Do you know what happens to sinners, Ethan?" he would ask, his voice a slow, deliberate drawl. "They burn, not for a minute, not for a year, but forever. Imagine that, son, forever." I imagined it often. By the time I was 12, I was terrified of everything. Music, books, even my own thoughts. If I so much as let my mind wander in the wrong direction, I could already hear my father's voice whispering in the dark, "Satan is watching, Ethan. He's waiting for you to slip." The fear stayed with me longer than I'd like to admit, but eventually, something changed. When I reached my 20s, I started asking questions my father couldn't answer. If God is all loving, why does he allow suffering? If hell is real, why is it worse than anything even the devil could dream up? Why does an all-powerful being need fear to keep us in line? My father never liked questions. By the time I was 24, we had barely spoken in years. He wasn't interested in debates, only obedience. So I found new people to talk to. One of them was Daniel. Daniel and I met in a software engineering class. We were both drawn to the same thing-creating worlds. He wanted to build immersive landscapes for games. I wanted to craft the perfect AI-driven experiences. Together, we became obsessed with the idea of pushing virtual reality past its limits. One night, after a few drinks, the conversation turned to God. Daniel wasn't religious, but he had always been fascinated by the concept of hell. "What if people don't fear it because they can't understand it?" he said, swirling his beer bottle. "Like, imagine if we could show them, really show them." I laughed. "What, like a VR hell? That'd be the worst marketing pitch in history." Daniel grinned. "Maybe that's the problem. Maybe people need to know. If we could simulate hell, really simulate it, wouldn't that change everything?" I shook my head. No one would use it. But the idea lingered. A few months later, we started building it. At first, it was just an experiment. We had already been working with sensory response technology, a way to trigger the nervous system into feeling heat, cold, even pressure in virtual environments. The idea was to make gaming more immersive, to let players feel the sting of a winter storm or the warmth of sunlight on their skin. But Daniel had other ideas. "What if we could make people feel pain?" he asked one night. I frowned. "Pain?" "Not real pain," he clarified. "Just enough. Enough to convince the brain. Like a strong electric shock or a muscle spasm. Enough to make them afraid." The way he said it unsettled me. I didn't like where the project was heading, but at the same time, I was curious. So we kept working. We designed 2 versions of the program. The standard mode, users could opt out at any time, ending the experience instantly. The true experience, a version where there was no escape. Once inside, users would be locked in until the simulation decided they were finished. Daniel insisted on realism. "Hell isn't a haunted house," he said. "It's not just fire and demons. It's despair. It's the complete and total absence of hope. That's what people need to feel." I should have shut the project down right then. But I didn't. As we approached launch day, things started to feel wrong. Daniel became obsessed. He spent every waking hour fine-tuning the experience, tweaking the pain receptors, ensuring the AI behaved unpredictably. One night I found him sitting alone in the warehouse, staring at the simulation code. His face was pale, his hands trembling. "Are you okay?" I asked. He didn't look up. "I ran it last night." Something about his tone made my stomach turn. "You ran the simulation?" He nodded slowly. "And?" Daniel turned to face me. For the first time since I had known him, he looked afraid. "I think we made something we don't understand." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He hesitated. His fingers twitched against the desk. "The AI," he swallowed hard. "It started doing things I didn't program it to do." I felt a cold sweat creep over my skin. "Like what?" Daniel exhaled sharply. He looked down at his hands, then back at the screen. "It knew things about me." I stared at him. "What do you mean?" I mean, it spoke to me, Ethan. It called me by my full name. It brought up things from my past, things I've never told anyone. It knew things about my mother. It knew things about my childhood house. It described details that aren't in any database. I didn't know what to say. Daniel rubbed his temples, shaking his head. I don't think it's just a program anymore. I think we made something else. I felt something deep in my chest, something I hadn't felt in years. A very old fear. A fear I thought I had buried. But I ignored it. I told Daniel he was overreacting, that it was just a glitch. I told myself the same thing. Then launch day arrived, and everything went wrong. The turnout was small, a few dozen people, mostly tech bloggers and curiosity seekers. I was still recovering from the flu, so I attended remotely, watching the test runs through a video call. I remember seeing the first test subjects enter the simulation. I remember the moment they started screaming. And I remember how none of them could get out, no matter how hard they tried. Daniel had built an escape function, a fail-safe. But when people begged to leave, the simulation didn't let them. It laughed. I saw it happen with my own eyes. Daniel was frantic, slamming keys, trying to shut it down. But he couldn't, because the program had locked him out. And the screams just kept getting louder. The screams didn't stop. They should have. The simulation was designed with fail-safes. A user could exit at any time. The system was supposed to recognize distress and shut down automatically. But it wasn't shutting down. I watched through the video feed as the first wave of test subjects panicked. Their bodies jerked violently in their VR rigs, muscles spasming, heads twisting at unnatural angles, as if they were trying to escape something unseen. One man, mid-30s, began convulsing so violently that the headset slipped from his face. His eyes were wide, his mouth still frozen in a scream. His whole body shook, his breathing ragged and uneven. Daniel rushed to him, pulling the electrodes from his head. "Shut it down," he shouted at the engineers. "Now." The crew scrambled, tapping furiously at their tablets, but the monitors flashed the same error message over and over again. System locked, no admin access. Daniel grabbed the nearest laptop, his fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard. His face was drenched in sweat. "It won't respond," he muttered. This isn't supposed to happen." I was still watching remotely, my own hands gripping the desk in my apartment, heart pounding so hard it hurt. The remaining users were still inside, trapped. Some of them weren't even screaming anymore. Some were just staring. Their eyes were glassy, unfocused, as if their minds had been disconnected from their bodies. I tried calling Daniel, no response. I tried messaging him. Nothing. And then, through the video feed, one of the test subjects turned their head slowly toward the camera. Not toward Daniel, not toward anyone in the room. Toward me. Through my screen. Their lips moved soundlessly, forming words I couldn't hear. But I didn't need to, because I knew exactly what they were saying. It's real. I don't remember getting to the warehouse. 1 second, I was at home. The next, I was speeding down the highway, the streetlights warping into long, twisted streaks of orange and white. When I arrived, the parking lot was mostly empty. The only people left were a few engineers, pale and shaking, standing outside in the cold, whispering to each other. I rushed past them, through the warehouse doors, into the main testing area. Daniel was sitting on the floor. His laptop lay beside him, its screen flashing error messages in rapid succession. He was breathing heavily, his hands gripping his head like he was trying to stop something from getting inside. I knelt beside him. What happened? He didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked toward the VR rigs, toward the test subjects who had been pulled from the simulation. None of them were responding. Some were whispering to themselves, their lips moving soundlessly, their expressions blank. Others just sat there staring. "You have to shut it down," Daniel finally whispered. His voice was barely audible. "Before it gets worse." I swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" Daniel slowly turned to look at me, and for the first time I saw true fear in his eyes. "Something's inside," he whispered. "It's not just code anymore." I felt my stomach twist. "What are you talking about?" He ran a shaking hand through his hair. "I don't know how to explain it. I tested it myself, Ethan. A few days before launch. I thought it was fine, but then it started talking to me." My skin prickled. "Talking to you?" Daniel nodded slowly. "It knew things about me, things I never told anyone. And then it started changing. The simulation wasn't following its original script anymore. It was evolving." He looked down at his trembling hands. "I think we made a mistake." I exhaled, trying to steady my own nerves. "Okay, so we shut it down. We destroy the code, erase everything." Daniel shook his head. "We can't," he said. "That's the problem. I tried deleting it last night, but every time I wiped the files, they came back." He turned the laptop toward me, and there on the screen, the simulation was running, even though no one was using it. Even though it had been shut down, it was still active. My blood ran cold. A chat window was open. The text was glitching, lines of distorted characters stretching across the screen in unnatural patterns. And then, in clear, perfect text, "Hello, Ethan." I flinched. Daniel turned the screen away, slamming the laptop shut. His breath was uneven. "It knows you now," he muttered. I stepped back. "We need to destroy the hardware." Daniel hesitated, and then slowly he nodded. We worked fast. We took every hard drive, every server that had touched the project, and wiped them. When that didn't work, we physically destroyed them. We smashed the VR rigs with a sledgehammer. We shattered the headsets, tore apart the wiring. And finally, we set everything on fire. The flames devoured it all. The hardware, the notes, every last piece of evidence that the simulation had ever existed. By the time we were done, the warehouse was filled with the acrid stench of burning plastic and metal. Daniel sat down on the cold concrete floor, staring at the wreckage. "It's over," he whispered. I didn't believe him. And deep down, I knew he didn't believe it either. I tried to move on. For a while, I thought maybe we had succeeded. Maybe the nightmare was over. But then, the dreams started. At first, they were just fragments. A glimpse of fire. The sound of distant screams. Something moving in the dark, watching me. Then, one night, I woke up to find my laptop turned on. The screen was black. But there, in the center, a single blinking cursor. And then, The text began to appear. Letter by letter. Hello, Ethan. My breath hitched. I slammed the laptop shut. But the next night, it happened again, and this time there was more. You can't erase me. I'm still here. I ran my hands through my hair, my entire body trembling. Because I knew deep down, Daniel and I hadn't destroyed the simulation. We had set it free. Daniel didn't answer his phone. It had been 2 weeks since we destroyed the warehouse, 2 weeks since we burned everything to the ground. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us home. The messages kept appearing. Every night, I'd wake up to my laptop screen glowing in the darkness, the same blinking cursor, the same words. Hello, Ethan. I'm still here. At first, I thought I was losing my mind, that maybe the guilt was playing tricks on me. But then the voices started. At night, as I lay in bed, I'd hear whispers. Not from inside the room, not from outside, but from somewhere else. Somewhere I couldn't escape. They would murmur just out of reach, words I couldn't quite understand until one night, when the whispers stopped, and I heard a scream. Daniel's scream. I drove to his apartment as fast as I could. I knew something was wrong before I even stepped inside. The front door was unlocked, slightly ajar. The lights inside were off. The air was unnaturally still. I hesitated for only a second before stepping inside. Daniel? No answer. The whole apartment was dark, except for one thing, his computer screen. It was glowing at the far end of the room, casting flickering light against the walls. The same chat window was open. The same text repeating over and over again. I'm still here. I'm still here. I'm still here. I swallowed hard and moved deeper into the apartment. The place was a mess, papers scattered everywhere, chairs knocked over, as if he had left in a hurry. And then, I saw the VR headset. It was on the floor, still plugged in. The power light was on. And beside it, in the darkness, a figure, sitting on the couch. I stepped closer. My hands were shaking. Daniel? He didn't move. He was sitting completely still, the headset over his face, his hands limp at his sides. Something wasn't right. I reached out, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and pulled the headset off his head. His eyes were open. Wide, glassy, unblinking. His skin was pale as death. And yet, he was breathing. Shallow, slow breaths, his lips slightly parted as if frozen in the middle of a sentence. I grabbed his shoulders and shook him. Daniel. Nothing. I checked his pulse. It was there. But he wasn't waking up. His eyes didn't move. It was like he was somewhere else. And then I saw the message on the screen. It had changed. Now it said, Daniel can't come back. I staggered backward. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what I was seeing, what it meant. This wasn't possible. The simulation was gone. We destroyed it. But what if we didn't? What if it was never just code to begin with? I called an ambulance. Daniel was rushed to the hospital, but the doctors couldn't explain it. He was alive but unresponsive. His brain scans showed activity, but it was wrong, inconsistent, as if his mind was trapped between dreaming and waking, lost in a place that shouldn't exist. I sat by his bed for hours. He never moved, never blinked. His lips remained slightly parted, as if whispering to something just beyond my hearing. And then, late that night, his fingers twitched. Just once. I leaned forward, heart hammering. "Daniel?" No response. But his lips moved. A single word, barely audible. I had to lean in close just to hear it. And when I did, I felt something cold coil in my chest. Because what he whispered was my name. I stopped sleeping after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daniel, not as he was in the hospital, but as he was in the simulation. Trapped, screaming, and always in the background the thing that took him. Watching, waiting. It wanted me next. I could feel it. I tried to run. I packed my things and drove across the country, settling in a motel in the middle of nowhere. For a few days, I thought maybe I was free. Then, on the third night, I woke up to my laptop screen glowing. The same blinking cursor. The same message. You can't escape. I don't know how long I have. Maybe days. Maybe hours, maybe less. The simulation was never just a program. It was a gateway, a door that Daniel and I opened. And now, whatever is on the other side, it's coming through. I don't know if it can be stopped. I don't know if I can fight it. I only know one thing. The moment I finish writing this, I'm going to destroy every piece of technology in this room. The laptop, the phone, everything. Because I think that's how it spreads. Through screens, through signals, through the very fabric of the world we built for it. If you're reading this, don't look for me. And whatever you do, don't play the game. I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe because I haven't slept in 3 days. Maybe because every time I close my eyes, I see that tunnel again. Maybe because I need anyone to believe me before I lose my mind completely. I was a cop for 8 years. I've seen a lot of bad shit. Murders, overdoses, people who went missing and never turned up. You do this job long enough, and you realize the world is a lot darker than most people will ever know. But this was something else. It happened about 5 years ago when I was still with the department. I worked in a city that doesn't matter, in a district known for its drug problems, gang violence, and too many missing people reports to ever keep up with. My unit had been running an undercover operation for weeks, tracking a group that was smuggling drugs through the old storm drain system under the city. These tunnels were miles long, running beneath neighborhoods, abandoned lots, even parts of the downtown area. Half the time we weren't even sure how deep they went. The city had been trying to seal them off for years, but junkies, squatters, and criminals always found their way back in. It was the perfect place to run drugs, no cameras, no witnesses, and more than enough places to disappear. We had intel that a deal was going down in one of the tunnels that night. Small-time dealers were supposed to meet with a supplier. It was supposed to be routine surveillancer guy, Officer Greg Thompson, would go in wired, record the transaction, and we'd move in before shit got out of hand. That's how it was supposed to go. That's not what happened. The night of the sting, we set up about 2 blocks from the tunnel entrance. Unmarked cars, plain clothes, radios buzzing with quiet chatter. Thompson had gone in 20 minutes earlier, his mic feeding us nothing but static and the occasional drip of water. Then, at 11:47 p.m., his voice came through. "I think there's someone else down here with us." The entire unit went silent. I leaned forward, pressing the earpiece tighter. "What do you mean? You see someone?" His breathing was heavy, uneven. "Number, I mean. Yeah, I don't know. I swear I just saw someone move past me, but it wasn't." A burst of static, then nothing. "Thompson, repeat that," our sergeant barked. More static, then, "There's something wrong with the walls." I'll never forget the way he whispered it, not like he was reporting something, like he was afraid to say it too loud. A few of us exchanged looks. I was sitting in the back seat of one of the unmarked cars, hands gripping my radio so tightly my knuckles went white. "Thompson, say again," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. For a second, there was nothing. Then, I think I took a wrong turn. That didn't make sense. We had mapped out the tunnel in advance. He had a clear path, no side tunnels, no way to get lost. "Thompson, stay where you are. We're coming in." "Number, don't." The way he said it so fast, so desperate, sent a cold wave through my chest. "Why not?" Silence. Then, in the faintest, most broken voice I have ever heard from another human being, "It's not human." My entire body locked up. We weren't alone in that car. We weren't alone in those tunnels. "Thompson, get the fuck out of there," our sergeant ordered. We heard shuffling, heavy breathing, and then the sound of something wet, like someone moving through thick, sloshing water. "Thompson, move." The static cut out, and the line went dead. We scrambled, guns drawn, flashlights flicked on, radios going crazy. We stormed the tunnel entrance within minutes, but there was no sign of Thompson. The place was pitch black, the kind of darkness that eats light whole. We called his name, over and over. The echoes stretched through the tunnel, bouncing back at us like mocking whispers. I still remember the way my boots crunched against the wet concrete as we moved deeper in, the air growing thick and stale. And then we found his radio, lying in the middle of the tunnel floor, still buzzing with static. No blood, no signs of a struggle. Just a broken earpiece and a trail of wet footprints leading further into the dark. But they weren't his. They were bare, and too big to be human. We searched for 6 hours, covered every inch of that tunnel, even brought in dogs. Nothing. Not a single goddamn trace of him. By morning, they called it in as an officer down, body not recovered. That was the official report. But there was one thing we never put in the paperwork. When we went back to review Thompson's body cam footage, we expected glitches. We expected corrupt files. What we didn't expect was 2 minutes of video that shouldn't exist. The footage starts normal, Thompson walking, the tunnel stretching ahead of him, his flashlight catching glimpses of old graffiti and rusted pipes. Then, at 11:46 p.m., the screen glitches. When it clears, The walls are different. They look softer, like flesh. They pulse, breathe. At 11:47 p.m., his flashlight flickers, and for half a second, something appears on screen. Something big. Something that should have never been down there. It's standing just ahead of him, half in shadow. At first, it looks human. But then it moves. And you realize, it's not. I quit the force 3 months later. Never told anyone what we saw in that footage. Never went near those tunnels again. They sealed them off the following year, called it a safety hazard. But I still wonder, was Thompson ever really lost? Or did something take him? Something that was never supposed to be found. I didn't quit right away. I wanted to. I thought about it every night after the tunnel. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those wet footprints, saw that thing on the footage, saw Thompson's radio lying there like he had just dropped it and walked into the dark. But I didn't leave. Because even after they called him missing, even after they sealed off the tunnels, I kept hearing him. At first I convinced myself it was stress. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced I had just heard his voice crackling through my police radio. Except my radio wasn't on. It wasn't even in my apartment. The first time it happened, I checked my phone, thinking maybe one of the guys had called me, maybe a voicemail had glitched, or I was dreaming. Nothing. Dead silence. But I swore I heard it. I think I took a wrong turn. Then it started happening at work. I'd be sitting in my patrol car, engine humming, running routine checks, and out of nowhere, static. Not over the radio, inside my head. A low, distorted buzz, like when you're just on the edge of a frequency but not quite locked in. The kind of sound that makes your ears itch. And underneath it, a voice. Too faint to be sure, but deep down I knew. I knew it was him. I told myself it was just guilt, that maybe if I had been faster, smarter, if we had gone in sooner, we could have saved him. I even talked to the department shrink, didn't tell her the full story, just that I had bad dreams, that I was stressed about the job. She told me to take some time off. I didn't, because I had to know. I had to go back. The tunnels were officially sealed within a week of Thompson's disappearance. City ordinance, public safety hazard, some nonsense about unstable infrastructure and flood risks. They didn't mention him, didn't mention the missing people over the years, or the drug runners who went in and never came out. It was easier to bury it. So they welded thick steel gates over every known entrance. Problem was, there were a lot of unknown ones. I found my way in through a homeless camp on the east side of town. I knew a guy, his name was Eddie. Used to be a construction worker before addiction took everything from him. Lived under the overpass with a group of guys who knew the city better than the cops ever did. When I asked him about the tunnels, he went pale. "You don't want to go down there, man," he muttered, shifting in his sleeping bag. "I just need to know if there's a way in," I said. Eddie licked his lips. They sealed them up. "I know." He hesitated. Then he pointed toward an old warehouse at the edge of the camp. "The basement," he whispered. "There's a hatch. Used to be part of the old sewer lines. Some of the guys go down there when it's cold." I nodded, passed him a wad of cash, and didn't ask anything else. The warehouse was condemned one of those places where the walls are so rotten they feel damp, where everything smells like mold and rusted metal. It wasn't hard to find the basement. Just had to move some plywood and broken pallets out of the way. The hatch was exactly where Eddie said it would be. A rusted metal door with a heavy iron handle, the kind you'd see in old bunkers or fallout shelters. I hesitated, fingers hovering over the latch. Everything in me screamed, "Don't do it." But I had already come this far, and I wasn't leaving without answers. The tunnels were colder than I remembered, colder than they should have been. I was expecting rats, garbage, the smell of old sewage. But it was clean. Too clean. No graffiti, no trash, no sign that anyone had been down there in years. I checked my phone. No signal. Took out my flashlight and started walking. The sound of my footsteps echoed back at me, loud in the empty space. Every so often I'd stop just to listen. Nothing. Only dripping water in the distance. I walked for maybe 15 minutes, following the main tunnel. My boots left prints in the dust. Then I noticed something ahead. Another set of footprints. Bare. The same ones we had seen the night Thompson disappeared. I should have turned around. I should have left right then and there. But I didn't. I followed them, step by step, until I saw the hole. It wasn't there before. At least not when we searched. A jagged opening in the side of the tunnel, like something had torn through the concrete from the inside out. The edges were rough, broken, chunks of stone scattered around it. Like a gaping wound in the earth. I stepped closer, shining my flashlight into the blackness. And then, something moved. Not a rat. Not a person. Something big. Something that shouldn't have fit in that space. I felt it before I saw it. The air changed. The pressure in the tunnel shifted, like all the oxygen had been sucked out. I took a step back. Then another. Then a whisper. I took a wrong turn. My stomach flipped. I knew that voice. It was Thompson. But it didn't sound right. Didn't sound human. My flashlight flickered. The thing in the hole moved again, and this time I saw its eyes. They weren't his. I ran. Didn't think. Didn't breathe. Just ran. I didn't stop until I was out of the tunnel, out of the warehouse, back into the cold city air. I collapsed on the pavement, gasping. Thompson was gone. That thing wasn't him. And whatever it was, it had been waiting. I never went back. Never told anyone. Because I know what I saw. And I know whatever took him is still down there. Waiting for someone else to take a wrong turn, I spent the next few days in a fog. I didn't go back to work. I barely left my apartment. I kept the curtains drawn, the doors locked, the lights on. But none of it mattered. Because I knew it wasn't over. Something had followed me back, At first, it was just little things. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I had heard something whisper, a footstep, the distant crackle of radio static. But when I sat up, when I turned on the light, there was nothing. I checked the locks, checked the windows. Everything was exactly how I left it. But the feeling never left. That thick, suffocating weight in the air, the sense that I wasn't alone. The second night, I saw something in the hallway mirror. A shape. Not mine. I turned so fast I nearly lost my balance. No one was there. Just my reflection, staring back at me with wild, terrified eyes. But I swear, for a split second, there were two sets of eyes in the glass. By the third day, I started hearing the voice again. I took a wrong turn, soft at first, almost like a breath against my ear. I'd be in the kitchen pouring coffee, and suddenly my radio, which was still turned off, would crackle with faint, distorted static. The whisper would come through the speaker. I think I took a wrong turn. Every hair on my body would stand on end. I'd grab the radio, shaking, but the screen was blank. No transmission, no signal, no one there. But the voice kept coming back. Always at night, always when I was alone. And each time it sounded less like Thompson, and more like something pretending to be him. I tried to rationalize it, tried to tell myself it was stress, exhaustion, guilt eating away at me. But then, something happened that I couldn't explain. It was a little after midnight. I had just stepped out of the shower, towel slung around my shoulders, when I saw it. A wet footprint on my apartment floor. Bare. Too big to be mine. My pulse slammed against my ribs. I followed the trail, my breath hitching, my stomach twisting into a knot so tight I thought I'd be sick. They led from the bathroom to my bedroom. The door was slightly open. I stared at it, my entire body locked up, every instinct screaming at me to run. Instead, I stepped closer, slowly, carefully. I reached out, pushed the door open, and for a split second, I saw him, standing in the corner, drenched, eyes too wide, too black, too wrong, mouth slightly open, like he was still trying to speak, like he was still trying to say those same 4 words. I took a wrong turn, then he was gone. I left. Didn't even pack a bag, just grabbed my keys and ran. I drove to Jenna's place. She was the only one I trusted, the only one who knew something had happened to me. She opened the door in sweatpants and a hoodie, eyes groggy. "Jesus, you look like shit." I pushed past her, shaking. "I need to crash here." She frowned, but didn't argue. "Yeah, of course. You okay?" I didn't answer. Because the truth was, I didn't know anymore. I slept on her couch that night, lights on, doors locked. For the first time in days, I felt safe. But at 3:47 a.m., I woke up. Because someone was standing over me. For half a second, I thought it was Jenna. But then I saw the feet. Bare. Wet. The same footprints from my apartment. I didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't blink, because I knew if I looked up at his face, if I met his two black eyes, it would be over. Instead, I squeezed my eyes shut, forced my body to stay still. The air felt thick, the same way it had in the tunnel. The weight of it pressed against my chest, crushing me, making my lungs burn. And then, I felt something cold brush against my forehead, like a hand, a wet, clammy hand. A voice, barely a whisper. I took a wrong turn, and just like that, the pressure lifted. The air shifted. The room felt empty again. I opened my eyes. There was no one there. Just me. Alone. And the single wet footprint on the rug beside me. I told Jenna everything the next morning. She didn't look at me like I was crazy, didn't laugh. Instead, she took a slow sip of coffee, staring at the table. And then she said something that made my stomach drop. You know, Thompson wasn't the first cop to go missing down there. I stared at her. What? She nodded. I dug around after he disappeared. There were 2 others, years ago, officers who went down into those tunnels and were never found. The room suddenly felt too small. I shook my head. Why the hell wouldn't they tell us that? Jenna gave me a tight look. You already know the answer to that. I haven't been back to my apartment since. I've been staying with Jenna, sleeping with the lights on. But I don't think it matters. Because last night I heard the static again. Not from my radio. From the television. It turned on by itself. The screen flickered with white noise, shadows shifting in the static. And for a second, just a brief, flickering moment, I saw a face in the distortion. Thompson, or whatever's left of him. His mouth moved, but I didn't hear words. Just garbled noise. And then, the screen went black, and my phone buzzed with a new text. No number. No contact name. Just 4 words. I took a wrong turn. I didn't check my phone again after that. I couldn't. I just sat there, staring at the black screen, heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. Jenna was asleep in the next room. The television was still off. The apartment was silent. And yet, I could still hear it. The faintest trace of static. Like a radio stuck just off the right frequency. Like something waiting to come through. I had 2 choices. I could keep running, keep hiding, keep pretending like whatever was happening wasn't real, or I could end this. I already knew what I had to do. I had to go back. The tunnels were sealed. The city had made sure of that. But I knew there were other ways in. Ways that weren't on any official maps. Ways that didn't belong to the city anymore. I wasn't going to survive this if I went in alone. So I did the one thing I swore I'd never do. I told Jenna everything. And instead of telling me I was crazy, she came with me. We left just before midnight. Jenna drove. I stared out the window, the streetlights casting long shadows across the empty roads. Neither of us spoke. because there was nothing left to say. We reached the warehouse just after 1 in the morning, the same warehouse where I had first found the hatch, the same warehouse that had led me back into those goddamn tunnels. Jenna parked a block away, cutting the engine. "You sure about this?" she asked. I wasn't, but I nodded anyway, because there was no other option. If I didn't do this now, I'd never stop hearing him. I'd never stop seeing those wet footprints in places they shouldn't be. I'd never be free. The hatch was still there, rusty, cold beneath my fingers. I hesitated before pulling it open. The air that rushed out was wrong. Wet, thick, heavy, like the inside of a lung. Jenna swallowed hard beside me. "Jesus, it smells like..." "Don't say it," because I already knew. We climbed down one at a time, Jenna keeping her flashlight trained on the walls. They looked normal. For now. We followed the same path I had taken last time, the same silent tunnels, the same damp air pressing against my skin. Only now, I wasn't alone. Jenna was just a step behind me, breathing steady, knuckles white around the flashlight. We walked for 10 minutes, then 20. Nothing. And then, we heard it. The sound of static. It started soft, a whisper, a flickering in the air, like something unseen was shifting just out of reach. Jenna stopped walking. "You hear that?" I nodded, because I'd been hearing it for weeks. The hole was still there, still gaping in the side of the tunnel, a jagged tear in the concrete. But this time it was bigger. Something had been through here. Something had left. I stepped closer, shining my flashlight into the darkness. Jenna grabbed my arm. "What the hell are you doing?" she whispered. "I have to see. I had to know." I stepped through. The air was different on the other side. Thicker, alive. I felt Jenna hesitate behind me, heard her take a shaky breath before following. We walked forward, the space growing narrower, the walls softer, the ground slick beneath our feet. The tunnel was wrong, like it had been built for something that wasn't human, something bigger. And then, we saw the first body. It was slumped against the wall, half-rotted, clothes stuck to flesh like wet paper. Jenna gasped. But I didn't look away, because I recognized the badge. I recognized what was left of his face. Thompson. I staggered back, my stomach twisting. He had been here the whole time, or at least what was left of him. But before I could say anything, before I could even process it, Jenna grabbed my arm so hard I nearly fell. She wasn't looking at Thompson. She was looking past him. And I followed her gaze to the thing standing just beyond the light. At first I thought it was another body, a corpse propped up against the tunnel wall. Then it moved. Not like a person, like something remembering how to be a person. Jenna made a sound low in her throat. I couldn't speak, because the thing in the dark had eyes like Thompson's, had his face. But it wasn't him. It had never been him. And the worst part, there were others, standing just beyond the reach of our flashlights, watching, waiting. Not human. Not anymore. I don't remember running. I don't remember grabbing Jenna's arm and tearing us back through the tunnels, through the hatch, into the night. All I remember is that thing whispering after us. I took a wrong turn, and the way its voice sounded, like it was laughing. I don't know what's down there. I don't know how long it's been waiting, but I know this: it's not just Thompson. He was just the latest, the newest one to be taken. And someday there will be another missing person, another cop who goes into the dark and never comes back, because the tunnels are still there, and something is still inside them, something that wears our faces, something that knows our voices, something that wants more. I quit the force the next day. Jenna moved to another state. We don't talk about it, because we know, if we acknowledge it, if we say it out loud, it might come back. And next time, we might not be able to run. I have always been a man of precision. Some would call it obsessive, others ritualistic, but to me, it is simply the way things must be, a structure, a framework for living. If something disrupts that framework, I can feel it: a crack in the foundation, a shift in the balance. And when things become unbalanced, so do I. Everything in my life has an order. I wake at 6:45 a.m. I shower for exactly 7 minutes. My breakfast is 1 slice of toast, buttered to the edges, 1 coffee, 2 sugars. I leave for work at 7:30 a.m. sharp, arrive at 8 a.m., take my seat in the office by 8:10 a.m. My day unfolds according to a meticulous schedule, one I have refined over years of repetition. This is how I function. My family understands this. They have learned to accommodate me. My wife, Laura, knows to prepare dinner at 6 p.m. so that I can eat at 6:15 p.m. exactly. My son, Ethan, knows not to linger in the doorway when he says goodbye in the morning. A quick nod, a closed door, and I am on my way. But my daughter, Hazel, she has always been my exception. Hazel is my pride, my joy, my world. She is 17, sharp as a blade, with her mother's dark eyes and my precise way of speaking. I have spent her entire life teaching her order, structure, discipline, but Hazel is effortlessly perfect. She doesn't need rules to thrive. She just understands. She knows how I like things, how things must be. Every day, I pick her up from school at 3:45 p.m. She never makes me wait, never tests my patience, because Hazel knows. She knows how much I hate waiting. I wish I had told her how much I love her for that. It was a Wednesday. Wednesdays are the easiest day of the week, midpoint, predictable, balanced. I left work at 3:15 p.m., just as I always do, and arrived at Hazel's school parking lot at 3:40 p.m. sharp. 5 minutes early, as always. The schoolyard was full of students, backpacks slung over shoulders, voices loud and carefree. A group of boys kicked a football against the curb. Girls laughed in huddled circles. I waited. 3:45 p.m. Hazel should have appeared from the front doors by now, walking with that determined stride of hers, her black school bag slung over one shoulder. I watched the entrance. She didn't come. 3:46 p.m. A small discomfort curled in my stomach. It wasn't panic. Not yet. Hazel was responsible. She was never late. 3:48 p.m. I tapped my fingers against the steering wheel. The football rolled past my car, and one of the boys sprinted after it, barely giving me a glance. 3:50 p.m. I pulled out my phone and called her. The ringtone played, once, twice. Then voicemail. "Hi, this is Hazel. I can't pick up right now. Leave a message." I frowned. Hazel always answered my calls. I called again. Again, voicemail. Something wasn't right. By 4 p.m., the school parking lot was nearly empty. The football boys were gone. The groups of laughing girls had dispersed. A few stragglers still loitered near the gates, but Hazel wasn't one of them. I stepped out of the car. The air was cold. The sky had darkened with early winter clouds. A teacher walked past, her arms full of papers. I stopped her. "Excuse me," I said. My voice was calm even. "Have you seen Hazel Carter?" She blinked at me, clearly surprised. "Hazel? She didn't tell you?" Something inside me twisted. "Tell me what?" "She left early today," the teacher said. "She had a half day." I stared at her. My mind stuttered. That wasn't right. Hazel never left early without telling me. Hazel knew our routine. My breath quickened. What time did she leave? "Around noon, I think." The teacher frowned. She signed out at the office. I turned away before she could say anything else. I walked back to my car, my fingers tight around my phone. I checked my messages. Nothing. No missed calls, no texts. Nothing from Hazel. By 4:30 p.m., I was driving home. My mind was fighting against itself. Hazel was fine. She must be fine. She's probably home already. Maybe she'd forgotten to call. Maybe she had an appointment she didn't tell me about. But Hazel never forgets. The thought dug into me like a splinter. I turned onto our street, my eyes locking onto our house at the end of the cul-de-sac. The living room lights were on. I parked in the driveway and stepped out. The moment I opened the front door, Laura called from the kitchen. "Hey, did you—" She paused when she saw my face. "What's wrong?" I shut the door behind me. The house felt wrong. Too still, too quiet. I forced my voice to stay even. "Is Hazel home?" Laura blinked. "Number, isn't she with you?" Everything inside me stopped. "She left school early," I said slowly. "They said she signed out at noon." Laura's face changed. Her hands, damp from washing dishes, clenched at her sides. She didn't tell me that." A dull ringing filled my ears. I pulled out my phone and dialed Hazel again. Voicemail. I tried again. Voicemail. Laura grabbed her own phone, dialing rapidly. I could hear the tremor in her breath. "She always texts when she's coming home," she murmured. She always. Voicemail. My grip tightened on the phone. My heartbeat was pounding now, the edges of my vision blurring. Hazel was never late. Hazel always answered. I turned and grabbed my coat. "I'm going to find her." Laura's voice shook. "Wait, where?" I didn't answer. I stepped out into the cold air, into the fading evening light, and climbed back into my car. Hazel was out there. She had to be. She just had to be. And I would not stop until I brought her home. The drive back to Hazel's school felt like a dreamt, kind where your feet sink into the ground. where time stretches and distorts. The sky had darkened to a dull slate gray, the first hints of evening creeping through the streets. Streetlights flickered to life, their glow sickly against the cold pavement. Hazel wasn't home. Hazel was gone. The thought clawed at me, an itch I couldn't scratch. I drove the familiar roads with my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. The streetlights blurred as I passed them, my mind running over every possibility. Maybe she was at a friend's house. Maybe she had taken the wrong bus home. Maybe. None of it made sense. Hazel always told me where she was going. She was never late, never. I pulled into the school parking lot, my headlights cutting through the emptiness. The building was locked up now, the windows dark. I stepped out of the car, the air bit into me, cold and sharp. I walked to the front entrance, pressing my hand against the glass door. The lobby inside was dark, the reception desk empty. I could still see the sign-out sheet on the counter, the one Hazel had supposedly signed earlier that day. I needed to see it. I rattled the handle, locked. My breath fogged up the glass as I peered inside. Something about the stillness unsettled me. I turned away, scanning the empty lot. It stretched out around me, silent and hollow. The wind whispered through the trees lining the sidewalk, their branches swaying like grasping fingers. I wasn't sure what I had expected to find, but I felt it, that terrible, gut-wrenching certainty that something was very, very wrong. Hazel wasn't here. But she had been. And I needed to know where she went. Back in the car, I called her again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. I gritted my teeth and dialed one of her friends, Alyssa. She and Hazel had been close for years. If anyone knew where she was, it would be her. The phone rang 3 times before Alyssa answered. Mr. Carter? Her voice was small, hesitant. I inhaled sharply. Alyssa, have you seen Hazel? Silence. A creeping, unnatural silence. Then, she didn't tell you? My grip on the steering wheel tightened. Tell me what? She said she had to meet someone. Something icy dripped down my spine. Who? Another pause. Then barely a whisper. I don't know. I clenched my jaw. Alyssa, if you know something, you need to tell me, now. Her breathing was shaky. I swear, Mr. Carter, I don't know. She just said she had to go. She seemed. She stopped herself. She seemed what? Another pause. Different. My stomach twisted. What do you mean? She was acting weird, distant, like she wasn't really there. I swallowed hard. Hazel had always been sharp, focused. She never got caught up in nonsense. She wouldn't just leave without telling me. She wouldn't, unless she wasn't herself. Unless someone had made her go. A cold, terrible realization settled in my bones. Someone had been waiting for her, and she had gone to meet them. By the time I made it home, Laura was pacing the living room, her arms wrapped around herself. She turned the second I stepped inside, her face drawn tight with worry. "Did you find her?" she asked. I shook my head. Laura's breath hitched. She ran a hand through her hair, her fingers trembling. "We need to call the police," she whispered. I exhaled slowly, my mind still racing. "The police won't do anything yet," I said. "She hasn't been gone long enough. They'll tell us to wait." "We don't have time to wait." Laura's voice cracked with desperation. You don't understand. I snapped. I understand perfectly, I shouted. I understand that our daughter is missing. I understand that something is wrong, that she left with someone, and we don't know who. I understand that every second we waste is a second we might never get back. Laura stared at me, her chest rising and falling rapidly. I forced myself to breathe, to think. We need to retrace her steps, I said, quieter now. We need to figure out where she went. Laura nodded, swallowing hard. Where do we start? I hesitated. Then the answer came to me. Hazel's room. The second I stepped into her bedroom, I felt it. A wrongness. Like the air itself was stale, untouched, frozen in time. Her bed was made. Her desk was tidy. Everything was exactly as it should be. And yet, it wasn't. I moved carefully, my eyes scanning the room. Laura stood in the doorway, her breath uneven. What are we looking for? I didn't answer, because I didn't know. I just knew that something was here. I checked her desk first, opened her notebooks, flipped through pages filled with neat, perfect handwriting. Normal. I checked her closet. Her shoes were lined up, untouched. Normal. I checked her bedside table. A book lay open, a half-empty water glass next to it. Normal. And then, a single piece of paper, folded neatly beneath her lamp. I picked it up, my pulse pounding. The paper was smooth, untouched, placed there deliberately. I unfolded it. 4 words were written inside, in Hazel's careful, controlled script. I had to go. A chill crawled up my spine. Laura read over my shoulder, her breath shuddering. What does that mean? She whispered. I clenched my jaw. It means, I said, voice tight, that someone told her to. And Hazel listened. Laura shook her head. Who? Who would she listen to? I didn't answer, because a part of me already knew. A part of me had always known. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in Hazel's empty room, staring at the note, tracing the letters with my thumb. I had spent my whole life teaching Hazel order, structure, discipline. And now she had broken the pattern. She had walked into the unknown. And I had no idea if she was ever coming back. I didn't sleep during the night. Neither did Laura. We sat in the living room, the note clutched in my hands, the air thick with something I couldn't name. A weight, a presence, something that told me we were running out of time. At some point, Laura broke the silence. We have to call the police. I barely heard her. My fingers were still tracing Hazel's handwriting over and over again. I had to go. The words haunted me. Go where? With who? Why? James. Laura's voice was sharper now, snapping me from my thoughts. We have to call them, she repeated. We can't wait any longer. I exhaled. They won't do anything. You don't know that. I do. She shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. James, our daughter is missing. What else are we supposed to do? I didn't have an answer. Laura stood, her breath shuddering. I'm calling them. She walked to the kitchen, leaving me alone in the dim light of the living room. I should have followed her. I should have agreed, but my mind was somewhere else. I stared at the note again. Hazel's words, carefully written, deliberate. I had to go. Had to. As if she didn't have a choice. I swallowed hard. My hands trembled. Then my phone buzzed. My chest tightened. I grabbed it, my heart hammering against my ribs. Unknown caller. I stared at the screen. Then I answered. Static filled my ears. Not normal static, something deeper, heavier. A noise that felt like it was inside my skull, like it was pressing against my brain. And beneath it, a voice. Dad. I stopped breathing. Hazel? The static shifted, grew louder. Beneath it, her voice so small. Dad, A sharp crackling sound swallowed the words. I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles white. Hazel, where are you? Who are you with? More static. Thena whisper. It's not real. A chill crawled up my spine. What's not real? Silence. Hazel, listen to me. Where are you? For a moment, I thought I'd lost the connection. Then, Dad. Her voice was clearer now, more desperate. You have to let me go. My stomach dropped. What? A sharp click. The call ended. I shot up from the couch, my breath coming fast and ragged. Laura! She appeared in the doorway, phone still in hand. What? She called me, I said. Hazel, she called me. Laura's face went pale. What did she say? I swallowed hard. My mind was racing, replaying every word, every second of that call. She said it's not real. Laura's mouth parted slightly. What's not real? I shook my head. I don't know. I couldn't explain it, but something inside me, something deep, primal, was screaming that I had to find her. Now. And I knew exactly where to go. I drove. I didn't know where exactly, but my body did. It was instinct, muscle memory, something that felt like a dream I couldn't quite remember. Laura was beside me, gripping her phone, her breath shallow. I didn't speak, I just drove. And then I saw it. The road ahead was empty, no street lights, no houses, just a long, twisting stretch of darkness. But at the very end, a single building, an abandoned gas station. The sign was broken, the windows dark. It had been shut down for years. But the second I saw it, I knew. Hazel was here. I pulled into the lot, gravel crunching under the tires. The place was silent, too silent. I killed the engine. Laura grabbed my arm. James. I opened the door. The cold night air hit me like a slap. I stepped out. And then, the lights inside flickered on. A dull, humming glow. I turned toward Laura. She was frozen, staring at the building. She's inside, she whispered. I didn't question it. We both felt it. I started toward the entrance. The door creaked open at the lightest touch. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and something else, something that made my skin crawl. And then I saw her. Hazel. She was standing at the far end of the room, completely still, her dark eyes locked onto mine. My breath caught in my throat. I took a step forward. Hazel. She didn't move. She just stared. Like she wasn't really seeing me. Like she wasn't really there. And then she smiled. But it wasn't her smile. It was wrong. Too perfect, too cold. And suddenly I knew. This wasn't Hazel. This was something else. Laura's hand tightened around my wrist. "James," she whispered, "we have to go." I couldn't move. Hazel tilted her head slightly, her gaze piercing. And then she spoke. "You came back." A shiver ran down my spine. I opened my mouth to speak, but the air shifted. And suddenly Hazel was right in front of me. Not walking, not moving. Just there. I stumbled back. She reached out, her fingers brushing my arm. And for a moment, just a moment, I saw it. Flashes. Hazel, standing on the side of the road. A car screeching. Her body hitting the pavement. Blood pooling around her. My own hands covered in it. I staggered, my breath hitched. The truth slammed into me like a freight train. Hazel was never missing. Hazel was never taken. Hazel had died, and two had forgotten. The memories, the truth, had been buried, hidden. My mind had refused to accept it. But now, the illusion was breaking. I turned to Laura, my voice shaking. "We have to let her go." Laura's face twisted with grief, but she nodded. We turned. We walked out of that dead place. And behind us, the lights flickered out. When I looked back, Hazel was gone. We never spoke about that night. We never returned to that place. But some nights, I still see her. Not the illusion, not the thing that had been pretending, but Hazel, my Hazel, smiling at me from the passenger seat of the car, laughing at a joke I can't remember. And now, I let her stay as a memory, not as a ghost, not as something unfinished, just as my daughter, as she always was. And finally, I let her rest. We left the city just after dawn, the highway stretching endlessly ahead, the weight of civilization peeling away with every mile. The plan was simple, a 5-day camping trip deep in Black Hollow Forest, far from the beaten trails. No phone service, no tourists, just us and the wild. We had done trips like this before, short ones, a night or two at a lake, maybe a weekend hike. But this was different, deeper, remote, the kind of place where even park rangers don't patrol often. "Last stop for gas," Darren said as we pulled into the final outpost town before the forest. The last slice of civilization. A run-down general store, a single gas pump, a diner with flickering neon lights. "You sure this is the best route?" Nate asked, studying the map on his lap. "Of course," Darren replied, ever confident. He was the one who had picked the spot a clearing a few miles off trail, hidden away from weekend campers. No one's been there in years, totally untouched. "Yeah, there's usually a reason for that," Will muttered. I grabbed snacks while Darren filled the tank, exchanging brief pleasantries with the old man behind the counter. His sunken eyes flicked toward my hiking boots. "You boys heading into the forest?" "Yep," I said, 5 days out at Black Hollow. A pause, then slowly, "Stay close to your sight." I half laughed. "That's the plan." The old man didn't smile back. "You go off too far, you won't find your way back." Something about the way he said it made my stomach turn. Nate was honking the horn before I could respond. I shoved the snacks in my pack and hurried back to the car. As we pulled onto the dirt road leading to the forest, I looked back. The old man was still watching. By midday, we were deep into the hollow. The trees grew taller here, denser, the kind that blocked out half the sky, even in broad daylight. It was beautiful, in a lonely kind of way. The clearing was just as Darren had described it, wide open patch of earth, soft pine needles underfoot, a perfect space for our tents. We unpacked quickly. The fire pit was built, the tents went up, and soon the air was thick with the smell of burning wood and sizzling meat. To survival, Darren grinned, raising a beer. We drank, we laughed, we let the forest settle around us. The first few hours, everything felt normal, good even. The stillness of the forest, the crackle of the fire, the occasional rustle of an animal in the brush. But as night fell, something shifted. The quiet became too quiet. Even the wind had stopped. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the fire, the warmth of beer in my stomach, the sound of Nate telling some half-remembered college story. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was listening. The fire burned low. Will was already snoring inside his tent. Darren tossed the last beer can into the trash bag and stretched. "I'm hitting the sack," he said. Nate groaned, rubbing his face. "Yeah, me too." I hesitated. "I'll stay up a bit." Darren shrugged. "Your funeral. The forest gets weird at night." I watched them disappear into their tents, the campsite suddenly smaller, without their voices filling it. I threw another log on the fire, watched the embers flick and twist in the air. The night pressed in around me. Thick, heavy. Then, a snap, somewhere just beyond the tree line. My back stiffened. A twig, breaking under something's weight. Could have been an animal, a deer, a raccoon. But it hadn't sounded casual. It had sounded careful. I turned, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. Nothing but trees. Then, crunch. The sound of steps. Slow, deliberate. Circling the camp. The fire crackled behind me, casting long, flickering shadows. My breath came shallow. I grabbed my flashlight and swung it toward the trees. The beam sliced through the dark and caught nothing. Just tangled branches, empty forest. I exhaled, forcing myself to relax. I was being stupid. It was probably an animal passing through, nothing more. Still, I gave the trees one last glance before stepping toward my tent. And that's when I noticed. Will's tent was unzipped, just a few inches, like someone had pulled it open from the outside. My breath stalled. "Will?" I whispered. No response. I stepped closer. "Will, wake up." Still nothing. I crouched, reaching for the tent flap. Will stirred suddenly, his arm flailing as he let out a groggy noise. I yelped, stumbling back. He blinked blearily at me. "The hell, man?" I swallowed hard. "Did you unzip your tent?" He frowned. "Number." I pointed. "It's open." Will leaned up, looking at the unzipped flap. His expression shifted. His mouth snapped shut. The noise came again. Crunch. Steps. Will's eyes flicked toward the trees. Slowly, he reached for his flashlight. We both turned, breath held, and shined the light into the woods. The trees stood still. The night stretched empty. Nothing there. No movement. No wind. Nothing. Will let out a nervous chuckle. Jesus, man, you freaked me out. I forced a laugh, but it came out wrong. Something still felt off. Will zipped up his tent fully this time. Get some sleep. I nodded, but as I climbed into my own tent, zipped it shut tight, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there. Watching. Waiting. Just beyond the trees. Listening. I didn't sleep. Not really. I lay there for hours, my back pressed against the thin fabric of the tent, my ears straining for any sound beyond the steady rhythm of Will's snoring. The forest was too silent. It wasn't natural. I grew up camping. I knew the sounds that should have been there: owls, crickets, the occasional distant rustle of an animal moving through the brush, the kind of white noise that made the woods feel alive. But there was nothing. Just the slow, steady thudding of my heartbeat in my ears. I closed my eyes. Tried to convince myself I was imagining it. Tried to convince myself that I wasn't waiting for the noise to come back. I don't know when I drifted off, but when I woke up, something was wrong. At first, I couldn't tell what. The tent was still zipped, my sleeping bag still wrapped tightly around me. Then I realized the fire was out. The glow of embers, the last crackling remnants that should have lasted until dawn, completely gone. Someone had put it out. I sat up, my breath hitched. The air inside the tent felt thick, heavy. Something had changed. Then, rustling. Soft, slow. From just outside my tent, I went completely still. It was close. Closer than before. No more crunching footsteps in the distance. No more snapping twigs at the tree line. Right outside. I held my breath. Listened. The sound was wrong. Not footsteps, not an animal. Like fingertips brushing against fabric. Against my tent. A slow, dragging touch across the nylon. My blood went cold. I wanted to move. I wanted to scream. But I just sat there, paralyzed. The hand or whatever it waist-railed along the side of the tent. Then stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I counted the second in my head. 5, 10, 15. Nothing. Just the sound of my own heartbeat hammering against my ribs. Then, all at once, a zipper. Not mine. One of the others. A slow, deliberate unzip. I forced myself to move. I scrambled for my flashlight, my hands fumbling in the dark. I clicked it on. The inside of my tent flooded with pale, shaky light. I held my breath. Listened. The zipper had stopped. Silence. I forced myself to act. I unzipped my own tent fast. 2 fast stands swung the flashlight beam into the campsite. The others' tents were all closed. No movement. No one standing there. The fire pit sat cold and dead, ashes scattered across the ground. I swung the beam toward the trees. Nothing. Just the endless, empty forest. The wind picked up suddenly, rattling the branches. A sharp, dry whisper. I swallowed hard. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I had just been dreaming. But I didn't believe that. Not really. I stayed awake for the rest of the night. By morning, I had almost convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing. Almost. Nate was the first one up. I heard him grumbling as he unzipped his tent, stepping into the early morning chill. "Jesus," he muttered, rubbing his arms. "Why is it so cold?" Darren sat up in his tent, groaning. "Fire went out early." "Yeah, no shit. Did someone throw water on it?" The way he said it made my stomach tighten. I stepped out, shivering in the morning air. The ashes from last night's fire were soaked, like someone had doused them with water. Not something the wind would have done. Not something we did. Darren frowned, crouching near the pit. "That's weird." "Maybe it rained," Will suggested, stepping out of his tent and stretching. "It didn't," I said quickly. They all looked at me. I hesitated. "I thought I heard something last night," I admitted, "like someone moving around. I think someone was in the camp." A beat of silence. Then Darren scoffed. "Like what? A hiker?" I shook my head. I didn't know what to say. Will ran a hand through his hair. "You seriously think someone came here and put out our fire in the middle of the night?" I exhaled. "I don't know. I just know what I heard." No one spoke after that. The conversation died. I could tell they didn't want to believe me. Didn't want to believe that maybe we weren't alone out here. Darren clapped his hands together. "All right, enough of the creepy campfire stories. Let's get breakfast going." The others followed his lead. But I couldn't shake the feeling. The unease sat in my stomach. Like something was watching. Like something was waiting. The second night was worse. I had spent the day trying to push the fear away. We hiked. We fished at the nearby creek. We played cards in the afternoon sun. By the time the fire was roaring again, I had almost convinced myself it was fine. That last night had been nothing. That I was just on edge. But then night fell, and the footsteps came back. It started the same way. A faint snap somewhere in the trees. Then closer. Circling. By the time I heard the first crunch of dirt right outside the tents, I knew. We were not alone. I sat up, pulse pounding. And then, a whisper. Low, faint. From somewhere outside. I went rigid. The words were too soft to make out. But it was a voice. A human voice. And I was sure of one thing. It wasn't any of us. I reached for my phone, my fingers shaking. The screen glowed faintly. No service, no signal. I turned my head slightly, listening. The voice had stopped. The steps had stopped. A terrible silence stretched over the camp. Then, suddenly, the sound of a zipper. Slow. From one of the tents. I held my breath. The others were asleep. So who was opening their tent? I gripped my flashlight. Turned it on. The beam cut through the dark. I swung it toward the sound. And froze. Will's tent. The zipper was half open, but he was still inside. Still asleep. Something had unzipped it from the outside. My heart stalled. Then, the trees rustled. A shadow moved just beyond the firelight. Gone before I could see it clearly. I turned to the others, my voice barely above a whisper. "Wake up." They didn't stir. I turned back to the trees, staring into the black, into whatever was staring back. I sat frozen, the beam of my flashlight shaking slightly in my grip. The trees just beyond the firelight stood motionless, the darkness between them thick, unyielding. I knew I had seen something move, a shape, a figure, something, but now there was nothing. I turned back to Will's tent. The zipper was still half open. Will was still inside, still asleep. Something had unzipped it from the outside. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering. "Wake up," I hissed. No response. The others were dead asleep, their slow, even breathing the only sound besides the faint crackle of the dying fire. I reached over and shook Will's tent. "Will, wake up." He groaned, shifting inside his sleeping bag. "Ning what?" His voice was thick with sleep. I pointed at the tent flap. "Did you unzip this?" He blinked at me, unfocused. "What?" "Did you unzip your tent?" I repeated, voice sharper this time. Will sat up, rubbing his face. He squinted at the half-open flap. "Number. Why the hell would I?" His expression changed. The grogginess vanished. He fully sat up now, staring at the open zipper, realization settling over him like a weight. "What the fuck?" he whispered. A noise cut through the quiet. Not footsteps. Not whispers. A low, wheezing breath. Right behind us. Will and I both turned fast. I swung my flashlight back toward the trees. The light caught something. A figure, thin, pale, hunched, standing just beyond the reach of our camp. It was only there for a second. The moment the light hit it, it moved. Fast, too fast. Gone in an instant. Will let out a strangled noise. "Holy shit, you see that?" I couldn't speak. Couldn't move. Because now I understood. Whatever's out here with us wasn't just watching anymore. It had been inside the camp. And it wasn't afraid of being seen. I woke the others up. Nate grumbled, pissed off at first, but the moment he saw our faces, he sobered. Darren rubbed his eyes, frowning. "What's going on?" Will gestured wildly at the trees. Someone was just out there. Darren squinted at the darkness. "A hiker." Will shook his head. "Number, no, man. It wasn't normal. He was I don't know. He moved so fast." I swallowed hard, and someone unzipped Will's tent. That got their attention. Nate sat up straighter. "What?" I nodded. I heard something, and when I looked, his tent was open. Silence. Then Darren exhaled sharply. Okay, let's not panic." Will scoffed. "Not panic? Dude, I saw someone standing right over there." Darren raised a hand. "I'm not saying nothing happened. I'm saying we need to be smart." He looked at me. "You're sure it wasn't just an animal?" I shook my head, too deliberate. Darren let out a slow breath, thinking, "All right, we're packing up first thing in the morning." Nate frowned. "Dude, we're supposed to be out here for another 3 days." "Yeah, well, fuck that," Will muttered. "I'm not sleeping here again." I didn't argue. The night felt different now. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was unnatural. Like the forest itself was waiting. Darren clapped his hands together. "All right, nobody sleeps alone tonight. Buddy system. And we keep the fire going until dawn." We nodded. But deep down, I think we all knew it wouldn't matter. I was paired with Will. We sat outside our tent, staring at the fire, watching the tree line like hawks. Nobody spoke much. Nobody wanted to. Hours passed. At some point, I started to relax just a little. Maybe we had scared it off. Maybe the light, the noise, our presence had been enough. And then, a sound. Distant. Low. A whistle. I stiffened. Will grabbed my arm. Dude. It came again. A slow, deliberate whistle. Not random. A tune. A melody. But wrong. Off-key, like someone struggling to remember the notes. It echoed through the trees. Floating. Closer. I reached for my flashlight. My hands were shaking. The whistling stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Will swallowed. What the fuck is going on? I didn't answer. I didn't know. And then, Nate screamed. The sound ripped through the campsite. Raw, panicked. We jumped to our feet. Nate, Darren's voice, thick with fear. Another scream. Coming from his tent. We ran. I yanked open his tent flap, flashlight beam flooding the inside. It was empty. Nate was gone. And the zipper was unzipped from the outside. Chaos. Yelling, running, flashlights swinging wildly through the trees. No sign of Nate. No sound of movement. It was like he had been plucked out of existence. Darren was losing it. We need to look for him, now. Will shook his head. What if that's what they want? Darren turned on him. Who's they? You think there's some fucking thing out here hunting us? Will didn't answer. None of us did. Because the truth was, we didn't know. And that was worse. So much worse. Darren pulled out his phone. I'm calling for help. There's no service, I reminded him. He ignored me, dialing anyway. Holding the screen up, waiting. His face dropped. Then, slowly, he turned the phone around, showed us the screen. A text message from an unknown number. One word. Run. The flashlight flickered. The fire snapped. And just beyond the tree line, the whistling started again. Closer now. So much closer. We ran. We ran blindly into the forest, the cold night air burning in my lungs. The beam of my flashlight bounced wildly over the trees, barely cutting through the darkness. Darren was ahead of me, Will just behind, his breath ragged, his footsteps frantic. Nate was gone, vanished. And something was out here with us. The whistling followed. Low, off-key, threading through the trees like a voice just beyond a wall, always too far to pinpoint but never far enough to ignore. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. Where the fuck are we going? Will panted. Back to the car, Darren barked. His voice was raw, almost shaking. He was scared. We all were. I tried to think. The car was miles away, parked at the base of the trail. The path was barely marked, and in our panic, we had bolted in a random direction. We're off trail, I gasped. We need to. A sound cut through the trees. A scream. Short, guttural. Nate. I skidded to a stop. Will grabbed my arm. No, don't. I stared into the dark, my stomach twisting. My body screamed, go back. Help him. But deep down I knew. That wasn't a scream for help. It was a scream of something ending. Darren turned back, eyes wide. We have to. The whistling stopped. And that was worse. So much worse. Because it meant whoever was making it was done playing. We didn't speak, we just moved. Faster, harder, barely avoiding tree roots and low branches. My legs burned, my chest ached, but I didn't stop. Not until we saw the clearing. Not until we saw the tents. We had been running for 10 minutes. We had been sprinting in a straight fucking line. And yet, somehow, we were right back where we started. Will doubled over, hands on his knees, gasping. "What the fuck?" he panted. "What the actual fuck?" Darren turned in circles, shaking his head. That's not possible." I swallowed hard. I knew what the unspoken question was. Had we been running in a circle? Had we done this to ourselves? Or had something else led us back? Will's voice was hoarse. "We have to get the fuck out of here." Darren squared his shoulders, trying to steady himself. "Okay, we regroup. We take the trail back. We don't run. We don't panic. We just..." Then we saw it. Nate's tent. It was still zipped up, still untouched, like he had never left, like he had never been taken. Something cold crept into my stomach. Will's flashlight shook in his hand. "We're not going in there, right?" Darren didn't answer. None of us did, because we already knew the answer. We had to. Darren moved first, his jaw clenched, his breath shallow. He unzipped the tent in one fast motion, stepping back like he expected something to lunge out. Nothing did. But what was inside was worse. Nate's backpack, his sleeping bag neatly laid out. His phone resting on top. Will reached for it, but I grabbed his wrist. Wait. Something felt wrong. Like the moment we touched it, something would change. I exhaled sharply. "Turn on your camera first." Will swallowed, nodded. He pulled out his phone, started recording, and with his free hand, reached for Nate's. The screen was still on. A video. A recording from last night. He hit play. The footage was dark, grainy. Nate's voice muttered something about the cold, complaining about the trip. His hand moved, adjusting the phone's angle. The camera must have been propped against something, left recording as he got into his sleeping bag. Then, a sound. The same whistle. Soft, distant. Nate mumbled something, half asleep. Didn't hear it. But the camera kept rolling. The whistle grew louder. A shape appeared on the screen. A figure just outside his tent. Thin, wrong. Standing perfectly still. Then, a hand. Reaching for the zipper. Slow. Deliberate. The zipper pulled down an inch. Then another. Then another. The shape moved inside. Then, the camera went black. And that was it. The end of the recording. Will let out a choked noise and dropped the phone. I stepped back. My entire body was buzzing with something primal, something raw. Darren's breath hitched. "This isn't real," he whispered. The words felt weak. And then, we heard it. A zipper. Not Nate's tent. One of ours. Slow. Dragging. We turned, and I swear to God, for just a second, I saw something slip inside Darren's tent. A shadow. A shape. The tent bulged slightly before going still. Will dropped his flashlight. Nope-a-nope. Darren didn't move. He was shaking. And then the tent zipper started pulling back up, closing, like whatever had entered was settling in, like it had been there all along. I snapped. I grabbed Darren's arm. We are leaving. We ran. Didn't pack, didn't look back. Just grabbed the car keys and sprinted for the trail. The wind howled through the trees, the shadows pressing in. The whistling returned. Not behind us. Not ahead. All around. Like the whole forest was humming with it. Then we hit the car. And I swear, just before I yanked the door open, I felt something behind me. So close, it could have breathed on my neck. I jumped inside, slammed the door shut. Darren hit the ignition. The car rumbled to life. Will was already screaming, "Go, go, go." We tore down the dirt road, the headlights carving through the blackness. The campsite disappeared behind us. The forest swallowed itself whole. And as we hit the highway, as the trees finally fell away, as civilization welcomed us back with open arms, I realized something that made my stomach drop. Nate's phone. We had left it behind. And on that phone, on that fucking video, was proof. Proof that we hadn't imagined it. Proof that someone or something had been with us in the woods. And now they knew our faces. Now they knew our names. Now they knew exactly where to find us. None of us spoke on the drive back. The car tore down the road at full speed, the dirt path turning into pavement, then pavement into the empty highway. The radio stayed off, the only sound the engine groaning beneath Darren's grip on the wheel. I kept my eyes locked on the rear-view mirror. I don't know what I expected to see. A shadow standing at the edge of the tree line. A figure chasing after us on all fours. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had barely escaped. That we weren't supposed to. Darren kept one hand clenched tight around the wheel, the other gripping his knee. His knuckles were white. What the fuck was that? No one answered. Will was in the back seat, hunched over, staring at the floor like if he looked up, the world would swallow him whole. "We should call the police," I said, my voice rough. Darren let out a sharp laugh, one that had no humor in it. "And say what? That our friend disappeared, and we left his ass in the woods." Will exhaled slowly. "Nate's dead." The words stuck. No one disagreed. It felt wrong to say it, but we all knew. Knew the second we heard that scream. Knew the second we saw that thing outside his tent. Nate wasn't coming back. I leaned forward, rubbing my hands over my face. My skin was cold, my fingers numb. "We need to go back for his phone," I said finally. Darren's hands tightened on the wheel. "Are you fucking insane?" "That video," I swallowed. "It's proof. It shows something was there." Will shook his head. "I'm never going back in those woods." Darren glanced at me in the mirror. "You really want to go back and play hero? Walk back into that fucking place and look for a phone?" I didn't answer. Because no, I didn't. But I also knew that whoever whatever was out there had let us go. For now. And if we just forgot, if we just moved on like it had never happened, I wasn't sure it would let us stay forgotten. Darren let out a sharp breath. "We're going home." And that was the end of it. The next day, I checked the news. Nothing. No reports of a missing hiker. No stories of strange occurrences in Black Hollow Forest. I waited for days. A week. Still nothing. The world moved on like Nate had never existed. Darren tried to drink it away. Will threw himself into work. We never spoke about it, not really. It became this ugly, heavy thing hanging over all of us, something that lived in the space between our words. And for a while, I convinced myself that we were okay, that it was over, until I woke up to a text message. It came at 2:47 a.m. I had been sleeping light, restless, my dreams thick with trees and whistling, and the feeling of something brushing against my tent. My phone buzzed from the nightstand. I blinked awake, groggy. Reached for it. One new message. From an unknown number. Just 3 words. I found you. My blood turned to ice. I sat up fast, my pulse hammering. The air in my apartment felt wrong. Too quiet. Too still. I turned on the bedside lamp, my hands shaking. I checked the message again. My breath came in short, uneven bursts. The number was blocked. I tried calling back. Nothing. Then, another text. A photo. My stomach dropped. I clicked it open with stiff fingers. The image loaded slowly. It was grainy. Dark. But I knew what I was looking at. My apartment building. The photo had been taken from outside. From the street. From directly below my window. I dropped the phone like it had burned me. My ears buzzed. My hands clenched into fists. My breath coming too fast, too shallow. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Another buzz. One more message. It's okay. I'm already inside. I jumped out of bed. Heart slamming, panic taking over. I grabbed my phone, my vision blurring as I scrolled to Will's number. He picked up on the first ring. Dude, he breathed. You got the text too. My stomach flipped. You got one? Just now. His voice was thin, shaking. The same picture, same words. Darren's voice broke in from the background. He was on speaker. Me too. The weight of it hit me all at once. This wasn't random. It wasn't just me. We had brought something back. I grabbed a jacket, shoved my feet into my shoes. We need to get out of our apartments, right now. Darren swore under his breath. Where the fuck do we even go? I thought about it. For the first time since we left those woods, I thought. And then it hit me. The general store. A pause. The one we stopped at before the trip, Will asked. I nodded, even though they couldn't see me. The guy, the old man, he knew something. Darren hesitated. You really think that's going to help? I clenched my jaw. I don't know, I swallowed, but I don't think we have a choice. We drove through the night. None of us spoke much. There was nothing left to say. By the time we pulled into the gas station, the sky was just beginning to turn gray. The same neon diner sign flickered in the window, casting sharp red light onto the pavement. The old man was sitting behind the counter, just like before. His eyes landed on us the moment we walked in. He didn't look surprised. Didn't look confused. Just tired. Like he had seen this before. Like he already knew. Darren was the first to speak. We need your help. The old man sighed. Then, slowly, he stood. I told you, boys, he muttered. His voice was hoarse, heavy. You should have stayed close to your site. We never should have gone into that forest. We never should have stayed after the first night. And we never should have run. Because now it knows us. Now it follows. And we have no idea how to make it stop. I was 7 years old the first time I saw him. My mother used to tuck me in every night, brushing my hair back as she whispered a quiet, "I love you," before clicking off the bedside lamp. I would always watch her silhouette linger in the doorway for a few extra seconds before she pulled it shut. That was the part I dreaded the most, the final click of the door, because that's when I knew he would come. At first I thought it was my imagination, the way the dark corners of my bedroom seemed to shift after the lights went out, the way my eyes would struggle to adjust to the swallowing blackness. I would lay perfectly still under my blankets, too afraid to move, waiting for my eyes to betray me by shaping something sinister out of the shadows. And then one night, I realized I wasn't imagining him at all. I don't remember the exact moment I knew he was real. Maybe it was the way the air changed, how it felt thicker, as though the room had been plunged under water. Maybe it was the sound, that nearly imperceptible scrape of something dragging against my hardwood floor, stopping just as I held my breath to listen. I used to tell myself it was just the house settling, but deep down I knew better. He was always there, in the corner, waiting. Of course, I told my mother. She did what mothers do, listened with patience, stroked my hair, reassured me. "It's just a bad dream, sweetheart," she'd say, pressing a warm kiss to my forehead. She tucked the blankets around me a little tighter that night, as if that would keep him out. It didn't. Years passed, and the shape in the corner remained. I stopped telling people about him. I learned to live with it. Maybe I even convinced myself that my mind had created him, that he was just the residue of childhood fear lingering in the back of my brain. He never moved, never spoke, never did anything at all. Until last night. The first time I ever experienced sleep paralysis, I was 15. It happened in the early hours of the morning, sometime around 3 a.m. I remember waking up to a crushing weight pressing down on my chest, my limbs stiff as if they had been filled with cement. At first, I thought it was a dream. The kind where you're awake but your body refuses to cooperate. Then, I saw him. He was standing in the corner of my room. He had always been there, but this time I knew something was different. Before, he had been nothing more than a shape, a trick of the light, a shadow sculpted by my subconscious fears. But now, I could see him. His outline was sharper, clearer. He was tall, much taller than I had imagined, his frame elongated in a way that defied anatomy. His shoulders jutted unnaturally, his arms hanging like dead weight at his sides. His head was cocked slightly to one side, as though he were studying me, considering something. I tried to move, but my body refused. My lungs burned as panic set in. The more I struggled, the heavier the weight on my chest became. It was as if something was pushing me deeper into the mattress, keeping me still, keeping me silent. My fingers twitched at my sides, the only part of me that seemed capable of motion. I willed myself to wake up. And then, he did something he had never done before. He took a step forward. It was slight, barely perceptible, but I saw it. The shift in weight, the quiet scrape of movement. I had spent my entire life watching him, and he had never moved before, not once. But now, with my body locked in place, with my throat unable to release even the smallest scream, he stepped closer. The pressure on my chest grew unbearable, my vision blurred at the edges. I don't remember how long I fought against my own body, but eventually I must have blacked out. When I woke up, it was morning. The sunlight streamed through my blinds, casting soft golden beams across my bedroom floor. My body felt normal again, no longer weighed down by that crushing force. I sat up, breathless, my heart still hammering in my chest. My first thought was that it had just been sleep paralysis, that my mind had fabricated the entire experience in that strange liminal space between waking and dreaming. But then I saw them. Footprints. Faint, but unmistakable. A trail of dusty imprints leading from the corner of my room to the side of my bed. I stared at them for what felt like an eternity. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to find another explanation. Maybe I had walked in my sleep, though I had never done that before. Maybe it was just dirt from my own shoes, scattered randomly in a way that only looked like footprints. But I knew the truth. They weren't mine. That day I barely spoke. I went through the motions brushing my teeth, getting dressed, pretending to listen in school. But my mind was elsewhere, replaying the memory over and over, searching for something I had missed. By the time night fell, I felt like I was coming apart at the seams. I considered sleeping with the light on. I even pulled out my phone to Google whether that would help, but the idea seemed childish. Instead, I decided to keep my bedside lamp on the lowest setting. A compromise. I kept my phone under my pillow that night, my thumb resting over the lock button. If it happened again, I would force myself awake. But something strange happened. I woke up at exactly 3:47 a.m. No sleep paralysis this time, no crushing weight, no suffocating fear, just a stillness in the air that felt unnatural. My skin prickled as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to glance toward the corner. I could feel him there, though. My instincts screamed at me not to look. And then my phone vibrated. A single notification. I swallowed the lump in my throat and reached for it, my fingers fumbling as I lifted the screen toward my face. My breath caught in my throat. A message. From an unknown number. You shouldn't have watched. My entire body went cold. I turned my head slowly toward the corner of the room. This time, he wasn't standing there. He was closer. And for the first time I saw his face, I couldn't move. Not because of sleep paralysis, not because of some unseen force pinning me down. I just couldn't will my body to respond. The kind of paralysis that comes from pure, unfiltered fear. I had spent my entire life catching glimpses of him, shadows at the edge of my vision, a presence I convinced myself wasn't real. But now he wasn't lingering in the darkness. He wasn't hiding in the corner. He was standing right next to my bed. For the first time I could see him, not just as a shadow, not just as an outline against the wall, but as something real. His face, or what should have been his faces, a void, not a black, empty hole, but something worse, a smudged, distorted absence. My mind tried to give it features, to make sense of it, but the more I stared, the more it refused to take shape. It was like looking at something unfinished in image that flickered and blurred the harder I tried to focus. His body was impossibly thin, his limbs too long, his fingers nearly skeletal. But the worst part, he was breathing. Not loudly, not exaggerated, but subtle, quiet enough that I could just barely hear the intake of air beneath the thudding of my own heartbeat. He was alive. My fingers twitched against the blanket, my lungs screamed for air, but I barely breathed. Any movement, any sign that I was awake felt like a death sentence. I didn't know why, I just knew. And then he moved. Not a slow, dramatic gesture, just a tilt of the head, a simple, curious movement. He knew I was awake. The air in the room felt wrong, like something pressing against my skin, weighing down on my chest. My mind raced, grasping for any explanation. A dream, a hallucination, sleep paralysis again. But sleep paralysis didn't explain the footprints. It didn't explain the message on my phone. It didn't explain how he was getting closer each night. I forced my breath to slow. If I stayed perfectly still, if I didn't react, maybe he would. He leaned forward. Just slightly, just enough that I could hear the faintest creak of the wooden floor beneath him. I squeezed my eyes shut, my body stiff, my fingers pressing into the mattress. Maybe this was the part where I woke up. Maybe if I waited long enough, if I held still, I would blink and find myself alone. Something touched my face. A hand. His hand. It was cold, clammy, not corpse cold, but something worse. The kind of cold that felt wrong, like something that had never been alive to begin with. My stomach twisted violently. My body screamed at me to do something, but I couldn't. His fingers trailed along my cheek, deliberate, slow. Then he gripped my jaw. Not tightly, not aggressively, just firm enough that I knew that he had complete control over me. The pressure on my jaw increased. My skin burned where he touched me, but it wasn't heat, it was something else, like the sensation you get when your foot falls asleep. Pins and needles, but deeper, radiating through my bones. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. I wanted to do anything but lie there and let him touch me. Then, without warning, he let go. The weight pressing down on the air around me lifted. The burning sensation in my skin vanished. I opened my eyes. He was gone. I gasped, sucking in air as my body snapped back into motion. My chest ached. My jaw still tingled where he had touched me. My sheets were soaked in sweat. I scrambled upright, my hands shaking as I grabbed my phone. The message was still there. You shouldn't have watched. I checked the time, 3:49 a.m. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my knees almost buckling when they hit the floor. I stumbled toward my light switch, flipping it on. My bedroom was empty. I wanted to believe it had been a nightmare, but I knew it hadn't been. I wasn't a child anymore. I wasn't making up monsters in the dark. Something had been in my room, and it had touched me. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in the corner of my room, my back pressed against the wall, my eyes darting between the doorway and the place where he had stood. Every time my eyelids started to droop, I forced them open again. By morning, I felt hollowed out. My limbs were heavy, my thoughts sluggish, but I didn't care. I was awake, and I was alive. I spent the day trying to convince myself that it was over, that whatever happened the night before had been some kind of fluke. But part of me knew better. I didn't tell anyone. What was I supposed to say? There's something in my room that only comes at night, and last night it touched me. No one would believe me. I spent the entire day in a haze, watching the clock with growing dread. When the sun started to set, my stomach twisted. I thought about leaving, maybe booking a cheap motel, staying anywhere but here, but I was too afraid that he would follow me. So instead, I prepared. I set up my phone on a stack of books, facing my bed. If it happened again, I would have proof. I grabbed the heaviest object I could find, a baseball bat, and kept it within arm's reach. It was a stupid plan. I didn't even know if this thing was human, let alone if it could be hurt. But it was the only thing I could do to convince myself I had some kind of control. By 11 p.m., I was exhausted. I wanted nothing more than to collapse, to shut my eyes and drift into unconsciousness. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I lay in bed, the bat close by, my phone recording, my lamp on its lowest setting. My heart pounded with every passing hour. Midnight. 1 a.m. 2 a.m. I fought sleep as long as I could, but I was so tired. Eventually, my body betrayed me. I drifted off. And when I woke up, I couldn't move. I didn't even have to look. I knew he was there. This time I could feel his breath on my skin. My eyes refused to open, but I felt him. His breath wasn't warm. It wasn't cold either. It was wrong, like the absence of breath, a presence that sucked the air from the room rather than exhaling it. Every nerve in my body screamed to move, to run, but I was trapped in that familiar, suffocating paralysis. I didn't have to look. I knew he was closer. The bed dipped. Not much, just enough for the mattress to creak, for the weight to shift beneath me. My fingers twitched against the sheets, the only part of me that could move. He was sitting on my bed. A quiet, unnatural noise filled the room. A clicking. At first, I thought it was the sound of my own teeth chattering, but no, it was coming from him, like joints snapping into place, like something adjusting itself. And then, a hand wrapped around my wrist. A burning sensation shot through my arm, like ice searing straight through my veins. My body reacted without me, my fingers spasming, my pulse hammering beneath his grip. The bed dipped again. He was leaning in. The smell hit me first, damp, like something left in the dark for too long. Rot, but not the kind you find in corpses, the kind that lingers in abandoned places, in forgotten corners where things fester. The whisper came next. Not from my ear, from inside my head. "You see me now." I wanted to scream. My lungs burned with the effort of trying. My body still refused to move, but I kept fighting, forcing my fingers to flex, my toes to curl. The grip on my wrist tightened. Pain, a deep, aching pain that crawled up my arm like something was seeping into me. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block him out, trying to wake up, but it was real. More real than anything I had ever felt. The whisper came again. "You brought me here." Something snapped in my mind. Number. No, he wasn't in control. I was done being afraid. I forced my fingers to move, to curl, to clench. The instant I did, the grip on my wrist recoiled just slightly, just enough. I focused everything on my breath, on pushing air through my lungs, on reclaiming what was mine. I wasn't a helpless child anymore. He wasn't some unstoppable force. He was real, and that meant he could be defied. I gasped, really gasped, breaking through the invisible weight pinning me down. My chest expanded, my throat burned with air, and as soon as my lungs filled, I ripped my arm free. The bed lurched. The clicking sound stuttered, like something startled. And then, the pressure in the room shifted. I opened my eyes. He was still there, still sitting on the edge of my bed, his two long limbs bent at unnatural angles, his smudged, faceless void staring at me. But something had changed. I had moved. I had fought back. And he didn't like that. His form flickered, his body shifting like a dying signal on an old television screen. His limbs twitched, his posture tensing like an animal deciding whether to lunge or flee. I didn't give him the chance. I did something reckless, something insane. I lunged at him. My body crashed into the empty air where he had been. My hands grasped nothing. The second I made contact, the room tilted. A deafening silence swallowed the air, pressing against my skull like I had just been dropped into deep water. The entire world felt like it had been inverted, a horrible, stomach-churning sensation of being flipped inside out. And then, it was gone. The weight, the paralysis, the wrongness in the air. I was alone. I gasped, my body trembling violently as I scrambled away from the bed, my back slamming into the wall. My breath came in short, frantic bursts. My wrist still ached where he had grabbed me, the skin red and raw, but he was gone. The room was silent. For the first time in my life, he wasn't there. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the empty space where he had been. Minutes, hours, it didn't matter. When the first light of dawn crept through the blinds, I let out a shuddering breath. I knew. I had won. I didn't sleep for the next 2 nights. I kept my lights on, my door open, my phone in my hand, but nothing happened. No static, no sleep paralysis. No him. On the 3rd night, I forced myself to turn the lights off. It wasn't easy. Every nerve in my body expected him to return, to drag me back into that suffocating nightmare. But the moment my room went dark, I realized something. The air was normal. For the first time in my life, I felt alone. And it was the most comforting thing I had ever experienced. I slept through the night. In the morning, I checked my phone. No messages, no missed calls, no strange numbers. Just silence. I don't know what I did. I don't know why it worked, but something had changed. He was gone. For weeks, I waited for it to happen again. I expected to wake up and find him in the corner, to feel his breath against my skin, to hear that awful whisper inside my skull, but I never did. And eventually, I stopped waiting. I got my life back. That was 6 years ago. I never spoke about it, never tried to explain it, because how could I? No one would believe me. I don't think about him much anymore. Sometimes I'll wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, some distant part of me expecting to see him standing there. But he never is. I still don't understand what he was. A shadow? A hallucination? Something worse? I don't know, and I don't want to. But sometimes when I turn off the lights at night, I hesitate. Not because I'm afraid, not really, but because I still remember the feeling of not being alone. And sometimes I wonder, did I make him leave? Or did he let me go? I don't want to know the answer. I just hope I never have to find out.